Hello world, my name is Andy Silvers, and today I'm departing from writing to talk about the HP ZBook Fury G8. Okay, so this is somewhat of an impromptu video. I am an HP ZBook fan, and I own an HP ZBook Power G7, which is the laptop that's right in front of me. And I've done a number of videos reviewing it and talking about it. And HP has recently updated the lineup, most of the lineup, to the 11th gen processors and the new Ampere graphics cards. So I wanted to talk about that today, and specifically the HP ZBook Fury 15 G8, which is the highest end ZBook offering, and at least as a laptop. So we're going to talk about that today. First, I just wanted to let you know that I am an author and that I wrote a book called Red Sprites and Blue Jets. It's available right now on Amazon. Has a 4.9 out of 5 stars. It is a middle grade coming of age book. It is very good, and if you're interested in supporting me, supporting my writing, supporting the channel, I would check that out. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the HP ZBook Fury 15 G8. So this is not a review of the laptop. I do not have a unit. I don't believe they're shipping yet, and actually we'll talk a little bit about that, but I don't have a unit right now, but I do want to talk about it and talk about the ZBook lineup a little bit. So I own the ZBook Power G7, which has a 10th gen i5 H series CPU, H standing for high performance graphics. And I have mine has a 1080p non-touch matte display, which I really like. 400 nit peak brightness, which is really important for me. It's got a Quadro P620 graphics card, 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, and it has a really good port selection, except that it doesn't have an SD card slot, which has always annoyed me about my laptop. But other than that, it's a very, very good device. Very well built, very well designed. So let's talk about the ZBook Fury 15 G8. So HP has a lineup of ZBook laptops, and the Fury 15 and 17, which refers to the screen size, are at the top of the list. They're the top of the list in terms of build quality and specs, in terms of what you can actually put inside. So the Fury 15 G7 was quite a powerful machine. You could go up to a maximum of an Intel Xeon W 10885M CPU, which was 8 cores, 16 thread, and you could go up to a maximum of an NVIDIA Quadro RTX 5000 with 16 gigs of dedicated VRAM, video memory. And you could go up to 128 gigs of memory, but if you wanted it to be ECC, error correcting memory, you had to pick the 64 gig maximum option instead. And it looks like that's still the case with the G8 model. So the earlier version of the ZBook Fury was very good. They improved it greatly compared to the ZBook 15. They just called it the 15 and the 17. It didn't really have a name. That would be the G6 model. They improved it significantly. It has much better ventilation, much smaller body and screen, or the much smaller form factor, which is good for portability, even though it's still thick. And they've improved the ease of access to get into the device and upgrade, which is one of the biggest and best things about the ZBook family. They've made a lot of upgrades and revisions that I really like with the G7 version of the Fury 15 and 17. So that's really helpful. And they included, for instance, a vapor chamber, which has been very good for dissipating heat, according to my research. It's very good for dissipating heat, and you get that if you get the Quadro RTX graphics cards, the 3000, the 4000, or the 5000 in the Fury 15 G7. However, there were things that I wanted them to update and change, and for the most part, they did it. So I believe it's three things that I wanted them to change for the Fury 15 G8 was first the screen. I wanted them to make it a 16:10 or 3:2 aspect ratio. The Dell XPS 15 and 17 have done this, and a couple other workstations have done it. It's incredibly great for productivity. If you're watching Netflix all the time, it doesn't really help much because you just end up with black bars on the top and bottom. But if you're creating content in Premiere, in Resolve, in AutoCAD, anywhere, it's really, really helpful to have a larger vertical real estate to work with. That's one thing I wanted them to do. That's one thing they did not do. However, the other thing that they did was they updated the graphics. So one thing I wanted them to do was include AMD's CPUs, because the AMD Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9 CPUs are incredibly high performance. Specifically, the Ryzen 9 5900HX. That particular CPU is one that I really wanted to see in the highest end offerings for the ZBook Fury. And they did not do that. But, interestingly, they still ended up kind of winning in the end. Now, I would still prefer there be a Ryzen 9 option, either the 5900HX or the 5900HS. Either one. But they ended up sticking with Intel. It's possible they have a deal with Intel. I'm not sure. But the CPU that's currently the maximum CPU for the ZBook Fury lineup, G8, is the Xeon W11955M, which is another 8-core 16-thread CPU. And this is the follow-up to the Xeon W10885M, which was the top CPU that they had before. So, looking at some benchmarks for these CPUs, we can see that the previous 10th gen Xeon W CPU, which again was the maximum you could get in the past, scored around 16,200. Of course, without context, it doesn't help much. So, here's some context. The AMD Ryzen 9 5900HX with 8 cores as well, 16-thread, 45-watt mobile CPU, scored 23,170, which is a much higher score than 16,200. So a lot more performance, which is why I really wanted to see it in the ZBook, the next ZBook. And one of the reasons for this is because it's not just more powerful, but it's more efficient because of the, I believe, 7nm process that AMD is using for that CPU. However, Intel has caught up to a large extent and is punching back. So the Intel Xeon W11955M, which of course is the 11th gen of that particular mobile lineup, has the same 8-core, 16-thread, 45-watt, but it uses a 10nm process. A 10nm process, which of course is more efficient because you're putting more horsepower effectively in a smaller space. So it's a more efficient CPU. I don't claim to be an expert on every single component of computer hardware, so if I make any mistakes, I'm happy for you to correct me in the comments. If there's anything that I'm saying incorrectly, please let me know. But anyway, so they're using the 10nm process now for their 11th gen CPUs. As such, the performance is greatly increased. So the CPU performance score is around 24,400. So for comparison, the Ryzen 9 was 23,000, a little over that. The older Xeon W 10th gen was 16,200, and the older Core i9 10th gen 10885H was 15,800, so quite a bit lower. So in fact, Intel did successfully create what looks like a CPU that is more performant than AMD's one of their top offerings for the mobile market. So, and they're all 45-watt CPUs across the board. So it looks like the Xeon W11955M is going to be a very competitive and very powerful product for the new ZBook Fury G8. And of course, there's two sizes, and it's available in both sizes. So that is the Xeon W. I should mention there are other options. You can get the i5 11500H 6 cores. You can get the i7 1100H 8 cores, which is a good middle of the road option. You can get the i9 11900H, and of course you can get the Xeon W 11955M, which, as I just said, appears to be one of the most powerful mobile CPUs for workstations at the moment. One of the reasons I wanted HP to go with an AMD CPU, specifically the 5900HX, was because of ECC support. So as far as I'm aware, nearly all of AMD's recent CPUs, regardless of if they're designed for servers or just home use, support error-correcting memory. As far as I'm aware, that's the case. Intel does not do this. Intel, their sort of mobile products typically don't support ECC, which for workstations is, of course, incredibly valuable. It's not as important for gaming, not as important for casual home use, of course, but for a workstation, it's nice. So if you want ECC, you still have to get a Xeon CPU through Intel. I would still like there to be an AMD offering, but because it would probably be less money and probably run cooler, but there isn't one currently. But you can still get the Xeon W 11955M CPU. M, I assume, stands for mobile, meaning it's the sort of mobile version of the Xeon W platform, as far as I'm aware. Anyway, you can get that, and you can get ECC RAM, and you have a lot of options. You can do 8 gigs, 16, 32, 48, and 64. The maximum you can get is 64 gigs of 3200 megahertz SODIMM ECC RAM, which for a laptop is incredible. That's a lot of performance. My laptop is the HP ZBook Power G7, so the previous generation of the Power, which is sort of the budget version of this lineup, the ZBook family. And one thing that's interesting about it is that it has a Core i5-10400H, and technically it has, let's see here, it has 3200 megahertz RAM, SODIMM RAM, but it's not running at 3200 megahertz. It's clocked at 2933. And this is because the 10th gen CPU in here does not support 3200 megahertz. It only supports 2933 at the maximum, as far as I'm aware. So that's why it's running at a lower clock speed. But it looks like with these 11th gen CPUs that Intel is now using, or really HP is using from Intel, you will be able to get the 3200 megahertz speed with whatever RAM configuration you choose. Now, as for the display, I said I hope that they would improve it, and they did, but they didn't fix the aspect ratio. So, the maximum display you can get for the ZBook Fury is a 4K non-touch HDR Dream Color display, which is a very, very nice display. That display is 4K UHD 3840 by 2160 resolution. It has a peak brightness of, it looks like 600 nits, which is very good for HDR color grading and even high-end photo editing. It has 100% support for DCI-P3, and it is, as HP calls it, their next-gen Dream Color technology, Dream Color being the sort of patented or trademarked name of HP's HDR screen technology. It's a 15.6-inch diagonal for the 15-inch model, and 17.3 maybe for the 17-inch model. So it's a very nice display. One major improvement that HP made was the refresh rate. So before, the max refresh rate was 60 Hz, which wasn't really terrible because, again, these devices are not intended for gaming, which is typically where you want a higher refresh rate. However, when doing productivity, when actually creating content, it actually can be beneficial. It can be beneficial to actually have a higher refresh rate. I would have been happy with 90 Hz, but HP went with 120 Hz. So the new Dream Color display, the maximum you can get, is this 120 Hz Dream Color display. I haven't seen it in person, but I imagine it's buttery smooth when you're dragging windows, scrubbing through footage, and of course rotating Blender models or rotating CAD models that you were working on. So that's a very good improvement. Like I said, I wish it was 3x2, maybe like a 3000 by 2000 resolution. I think would be a nice balance because, of course, the more pixels, the more it drains battery life. So that's something that I would like to have seen, but it does look like a noticeable improvement in the display, which I appreciate. As for graphics, they have improved the graphics card options pretty substantially. So the lineup looks similar to before, it's the next gen. It's the RTX A series. So basically, the ZBooks typically come with Quadro options. My ZBook Power actually has a low-end Quadro, but still a Quadro graphics card, which tends to be better suited for video editing, rendering, animation, etc., because it has the drivers to support it. That's the main reason that it's better. And so the previous generation, the ZBook Fury G7, I believe it was, yeah, the G7, had the NVIDIA Quadro graphics card options. They had the 3000, the 4000, and the 5000, and then they had one or two lower-end options. So basically, NVIDIA, that actually makes these cards, used what they had. They're called their Turing architecture. That was the most recent, up until recently, the most recent architecture for their graphics cards. And then before that, I believe, was Pascal. That was the architecture. It's basically this sort of framework, this sort of sub-framework for how they're actually putting together the graphics card. I'm not an expert on it, but that's basically how it works. And so NVIDIA obviously came out last year, I believe, with the new 30 series cards, the GeForce cards, which use what's called the Ampere architecture, which appears to be more efficient and more powerful. We would expect nothing less because you can't come out with another series of cards that are worse. So the Ampere series of cards are more powerful and, I believe, more power efficient. So the 30 series cards have been all the rage. People really love them, and of course, with the GPU shortage, it's been kind of difficult to get one. If you're a gamer, if you're a video graphics professional, like you need to do work on your workstation, but you also happen to be a gamer, the best option for you would have been the HP ZBook Create G7, because that one came with GeForce graphics cards, which are, again, better suited for gaming. They can still handle a lot of rendering and graphics work, but they are better suited for gaming. So you have the best of both worlds. You have something with an incredibly high-quality HDR display, which is difficult to find in a laptop for gamers exclusively. It has a modern, premium design, mil STD spec, whatever it is, military-grade performance or durability, and GeForce graphics. Now, the ZBook Fury does not have a GeForce graphics option, but it does use the new Ampere architecture. So, at the highest end, you have the new RTX A5000, and you may notice that NVIDIA has actually abandoned the Quadro name, which I personally don't like, but it is what it is. So they've abandoned the Quadro name, so now they're calling it the NVIDIA RTX A3000, A4000, A5000, and at the lower end, the A2000, which is only available as a mobile graphics card, because there's also a desktop version of the A4000, A5000, and there's actually an A6000 desktop graphics card, which has, I believe, 48 gigs of VRAM, if I'm not mistaken. It's incredibly performant. But for a laptop, these are pretty substantial. So, what is the performance like? So, if we take a look here at the benchmarks, the newest RTX A series, the Ampere Quadros, basically, but they're not calling them Quadros, are in fact better in terms of performance. You have the last graphics card option, which was the highest end, was the RTX 5000 Max Q. That was the top card you could get in the ZBook Fury 15 G7. I believe G7. That one had a score of 13,900, and then slightly below that was the RTX 4000 with Max-Q design, which had a score of 12,900, which is pretty good. Now, if you'll compare that to the equivalent or roughly equivalent GeForce card, it actually couldn't really compete. The mobile RTX 2080 had a score of 15,100, and I imagine a lot of this is due to the TDP, the actual wattage, which is an important factor here. So that card had a TDP of 150 watts, which is very substantial. And so that did make the previous generation of the RTX cards kind of a tricky buy, because on the one hand, you want to get the ZBook Create, ZBook Create, because it has the GeForce cards, but the problem is that device is a lot thinner. It doesn't have as good of cooling as the Fury lineup does. So you may not actually get all that GeForce performance, even if the GeForce card is there. However, now we have the RTX A4000 and A5000 to replace the Quadro version, the Quadro RTX 5000 and 4000 Max-Q. So those GPUs score 17,800 and 20,300, which is obviously a lot higher. And one of the reasons for this appears to be TDP. The A4000 goes up to 140 watts, and the A5000 165 watt maximum TDP, which is a lot higher than the 80 watt TDP of the RTX 5000 and 4000 Max-Q previous gen GPU options. I'm not 100% sure if HP is going to dial back the performance of these in terms of wattage. My assumption is they're going to have to, because of something that HP did not update, which is the power brick. So HP still gives you the same battery, which I don't have a real problem with because it's 94 watt hours, which is pretty close to the maximum you can take on an airplane. And then the battery, though, the actual power brick, is a 200 watt AC adapter. So this is the exact same AC adapter that they used before. And this is a problem to me because even though the new CPU might be more power efficient, it's still very powerful, and the new GPUs are also very powerful. And the competition typically does more. So I believe Dell is using 230 watts for theirs, and I believe some other companies are using 250 watts for theirs. So the fact that this has more performance across the board and yet still a 200 watt power supply would suggest that you're not going to get the maximum performance out of the maximum CPU and GPU that are available, which is a bit concerning, especially when you consider that the if you get the RTX A5000 and you get the 45 watt Intel Xeon W11955M, well, if you do the math, 45 watt plus 165 watt is already more than 200 watts, and you still have to power the keyboard backlighting, the display, and probably a few other things. So now you're talking about, there's no doubt you're not going to get that full A5000 laptop GPU performance. So HP really should have upped the wattage of the power brick, because you're just not going to get the maximum performance you can. And maybe it's a cooling issue. Maybe the ZBook, even as thick as it is, which is, I believe, a little over an inch, can't cool the A5000 and A4000 properly. But I do wish they had upped the power supply even a little bit. And you may think there's not a huge difference between 30 and 50 watts extra, but that could be the difference between getting your render done in 10 minutes or getting it done in 8 minutes, which when you're rendering constantly, it adds up very quickly. So that's something I wish they had updated, but the device isn't really available yet, so we will have to see. Now, right now, on HP's website, the device says, as I configured it at $8,000, which of course is a lot of money, it says it ships on 2/17/2022, which of course is next year, which is a long time from now. So if you're looking to buy this and you configure yours and it says it's shipping next year, my recommendation would be to just wait and not configure it at all. Because what will probably happen in November is they will have savings. They will knock the price easily $1,000, $2,000. And by then, hopefully, they'll be able to ship the device sooner anyway. So I would imagine if you're looking to buy this, I would wait a little bit longer till probably November. Because remember, it's not even going to ship by November anyway. So just wait a little bit longer. The price will likely go down to be more competitive with the competition. And then you'll be able to get it for several grand less. And again, that $8,000 price refers to what is basically the highest end configuration available. So keep in mind that is not representative of a middle of the line configuration. And then the other thing I wanted to say was about the storage. So the ZBooks are famous for having a lot of storage options and a lot of SSD storage, which of course is going to be very, very fast. So my recommendation, you can do what you want, but my recommendation would be to probably maximize the one SSD bay that you have to have. Now, technically you don't. There is an option right here to click none and actually not have any internal storage. But I wouldn't recommend it because then you'll have to put the operating system on there yourself. Maybe you want to do that. But here's what I would just recommend. Get the 2 terabyte SSD, which will cost you a good chunk of change, but it'll be a 2 terabyte PCIe NVMe fast SSD. Then don't populate any of the other SSD bays. And the reason for that is because, let's say you need a lot of storage, which on a workstation you might. In that case, if you get another 2 terabyte SSD, you get a second one, and I believe you can go up to 4 of them. So 4 times 2, obviously 8 terabytes maximum is what appears to be the case. So unless you can get, okay, so the hard drive looks like it's 2 terabytes. So it looks like 8 terabytes is probably the maximum. But I would not recommend doing that on HP's website and the configurator because 2 terabyte SSD, an additional one, is $1,100 additional, which is a lot of money. However, right now on Amazon, you can get a Sabrent Rocket 4 terabyte M.2 PCIe SSD, similar performance for $649. And if you don't need that much, if you only need 2, it's actually $250. $250 for 2 terabytes as opposed to, let's look again, $1,100 for 2 terabytes. So I would recommend just populating one slot so that your operating system will be there and everything will be ready to go, but then going to Amazon or whatever company, what you trust, maybe even Best Buy, whatever you want, and just picking up an SSD there for half the price, if not less. That's the ZBook Fury 15 G8, and of course most of that same stuff applies to the 17-inch version. The screen's going to be bigger, there's going to be a bit more room inside, but they're very similar. And the port selection is very good on the ZBooks. You've got mini display port, full-size HDMI, 2 USB Type-A's. I think the 17-inch version has 3. You have SD card slot, which the ZBook Power lacks, which still annoys me. And you have USB-C, which I believe has Thunderbolt 3. I'm not sure if they've updated to Thunderbolt 4 yet. I believe they have. And that's one thing that AMD still doesn't do as far as I'm aware. Intel still is proprietary in their support for Thunderbolt 3 and 4. So that is one advantage of the Xeon option over AMD's, for instance, Ryzen 9 5900HX, for instance. So that's an overview of the new ZBook Fury 15 G8. It is not a full review, it is more of an overview and analysis. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope if you're considering buying one that helped you a little bit. If you have specific questions about the HP ZBook Fury and any other device in the ZBook family, I'm happy to answer it. I own an HP ZBook Power G7, so if you have questions about that, please ask. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.